Chris Deerin, our Scotland editor, who's been at the launch of the SNP manifesto. Chris, what are the key points? How are the SNP trying to appeal to Scotland voters, who I guess are deciding between them and Labour in Scotland?
Yeah, those are the two big guns, Hannah, and we had the Scottish Labour manifesto yesterday and the SNP manifesto today. So we're a bit clearer as to what both of those parties are pushing at the voters. I suppose the first thing to say about the SNP manifesto is, they promised that independence would be page 1, line 1 of their manifesto. It wasn't page 1 because that was a big picture of John Swinney, as is the fashion these days, but it was page 3. Page 2 was blank. And page 3 had, in the largest point size I've ever seen in a political manifesto, vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. That's all it had on that page, and this screamy big headline font. So if anyone was in any doubt, which none of us were, about what the SNP believed most, that was quickly set right. But I think that they can say that, but actually, and Swinney said at the press conference that if the SNP get a majority of seats, then they want to begin negotiations either for a referendum or to take Scotland out of the United Kingdom. Even if they did get a majority of seats, which is unlikely, I think, on current polling trends, that wouldn't happen anyway, because there wouldn't be anyone on the other side of the table to negotiate with, because the unionist parties and the British government don't accept that as a mandate for independence. So they're still kind of at it a bit on how likely independence is and what the model would be for getting there. But there were other things that were interesting as well from the manifesto. One of the directions that John Swinney's been trying to push the SNP in since he took over as First Minister and leader was away from the radicalism that we saw under Nicola Sturgeon, especially in her coalition with the Scottish Greens. And it says very quickly in the manifesto, just straight after shouting about independence, that this manifesto contains moderate left-of-centre policies, almost sort of the equivalent of a supermarket ingredients label, saying this is what you're going to get once you open this a bit further. And he went on in his press conference to say, we're a moderate left-of-centre party in the mainstream of Scottish public opinion, practical moderate left-of-centre policies. This keeps being reiterated to voters. Now, there's a reason for that, which is obviously that for the last certainly 3 or 4 years of the Nicola Sturgeon administration and in the year of Humza Yousaf that we had, they weren't really practical or moderate. They were certainly left of centre, but probably further to the left of centre, certainly than John Swinney is comfortable being, and probably further to the left of centre than the Scottish electorate ended up being. And as we've seen, the SNP have taken a dive in the polls. The voters felt that some of the issues they were fascinated by, such as gender reform and other social policies, social engineering efforts, didn't really accord with their view of what the priorities of the country were. So you can see John Swinney trying to shift his party back towards that middle ground where they can reconnect with as he puts it, mainstream Scotland.
And there's a commitment in there to rejoin the EU as well. I mean, again, seems highly unlikely. I'm interested in how the SNP are trying to distinguish themselves from, say, Labour and also the Conservatives, I guess, on the NHS.
Yeah, and they're actually trying to distinguish themselves from Labour in a whole panoply of areas. I think what they've identified is that Keir Starmer obviously is trying to win in England by taking something of a safety first approach, because he's trying to unite the various warring tribes of England, whether it's the pro-Brexit people or the anti-Brexit people or whatever, however you want to divide it up. And so the manifesto isn't exactly throwing out radical, daring new policies. So the SNP have seen an opportunity there, I think, for them to almost offer a sort of braver, more traditional social democratic set of policies. And Swinney actually said, I believe people are crying out for principled leadership, which is prepared to argue for what it believes in.
One of the things that John Swinney set out today was what they'd call a bill to keep the NHS in public hands. Reports in the newspapers here today that Labour would pay the private sector, for beds, social care beds in private sector. Is that going to be a vote winner? Is this a real issue in Scotland?
Well, the NHS is certainly along with the economy, the key issue at the top of voters' priorities in what we've seen from the polls. And, I suppose the view of the NHS in Scotland, along with the view of much in Scotland, tends to veer towards the left, and towards, free at the point of use, and ensuring that the private sector's involvement is limited. Whether, the NHS in Scotland is not in great shape. Our waiting lists are vast. Lots of people are going private because they're having to wait too long for a hip operation or whatever. And so no one's particularly happy. Clinicians in the NHS are really worried about its future. So it's not like the NHS in Scotland is in great shape and the NHS south of the border is not. So there's a degree of maybe hypocrisy in this kind of approach. I think as well, I look at what Labour are saying south of the border, and they're not talking about privatising the NHS. They're actually, in a sense, looking at doing what Tony Blair did when he wanted to get waiting lists down, and they used these diagnostic treatment centres where they paid the private sector to bring those waiting lists down. It worked really well. The world didn't end. The NHS didn't become a private sector institution. I don't think Labour are talking about much more than that. So it feels a bit to me like a bit of political positioning from the SNP. And I do wonder whether voters would actually like to be seen more quickly through whatever means necessary, funded by the state, than they would say, no, actually, I'll hang on an extra year because I don't want to go to that, evil hospital bed in a private hospital, even if it's free to me. So it feels a bit like scaremongering and a bit of a misrepresentation of Labour's position. But it's politics. We're in the middle of an election campaign. So the SNP are going to do what they want to do. And you can think back to, New Labour's 24 Hours to Save the NHS campaign in 1997, again, which was a bit over the top as well. So it's almost in the nature of election campaigns for this kind of language and maybe slight misrepresentation to be used.
In a word, or maybe two. But as you've mentioned, the NHS in Scotland's not in a great way. Waiting lists are long. More people than ever are going private. It's a devolved matter. It's a bit rich, isn't it, for John Swinney and the SNP to run on a line of and they, bashing the UK government for arguably their failures in maintaining the NHS.
It comes back to the core purpose of the SNP, which is to make the Britain and Westminster feel like an unsafe home for Scotland with whatever political values you describe to Scotland. So, obviously Scotland relies for a large part of its funding on money that's coming from Westminster. If you can start to peel apart that and say, actually, they're going to privatise the NHS, or free at the point of use NHS, the funding for our NHS is all at risk, then, as with much of what they do, it's an attempt to create division and to suggest that the values being pursued at Westminster, even by a Labour government, are different from the values that are held by, perhaps a majority of Scots. So it's par for the course. I think voters are kind of wise to this. The polls would still suggest, although there have been competing polls recently through MRP and other things, that Labour are likely to emerge as the largest party in Scotland. After many years of the SNP being the largest party. I think that switch is still on, especially in the central belt across Glasgow and Edinburgh and Fife and places like that. So
that's interesting because, sorry to interrupt you. That's interesting though, because Andrew Marr was saying yesterday on the podcast that it was starting to look like that we'd taken our eyes off the ball a little bit in Scotland, and the idea that Labour were shoo-ins or didn't need Scotland anymore was, that there'd been a bit of a SNP fight back. Not so, you don't think?
I think fight back is probably too strong a term. The way I put it is that by bringing John Swinney in, who's very much a safe pair of hands, I think they've stopped the boat sinking any lower. So, most polls, when you look at, I think there's been 8 general polls since the campaign started in Scotland, and most of them have the two parties either even or Labour a bit ahead. Either of those situations, because of the way the vote is split through the country, would mean Labour having more MPs. Labour are going to have a very good night in Scotland on July the 4th. Whether they have an extraordinarily good night or just a good night, even if they're even with the SNP, they've come from 2 MPs to whatever, early to mid-20s. I think they certainly expect to do better than that still. I think the point for John Swinney was to stop the rot, to stop the decline. And that's why maybe it doesn't feel like Labour are sort of pulling away anymore, but they'd already kind of pulled away. And I think it's kind of stuck there at the moment. So that's where I think we are at present.
Chris, thank you so much. And just to mention a couple of other points from the SNP manifesto: a call for the abolition of the House of Lords and an end to spending on nuclear weapons. And I listen to every word you say, and I've taken on board your mantra of "it's only one poll." But I just want to ask you at the outset, the end of last week after we last spoke, we had one poll, I think there's been another one since actually, that put Reform for the first time ahead of the Conservatives on vote share. But consistently they're going up. How much can we read into this? What is the takeaway message?
Yeah, yeah. So one poll has them ahead. One poll, yes, I know one poll. But I wrote the piece about this the other day, available on the New Statesman website. Yes, Reform are climbing higher in the polls. They started this campaign, even before Farage returned to the scene, they were on 10, 11%. Now, according to Britain Elects, they're on 14%, going on 15. It's not unreasonable to think that in a few days' time, if you allow the Britain Elects tracker to just continue its work, they'll reach 16%. And you know what? In the forecast, that does mean they'll pick up a few more seats than just one. I'll be honest with you, I'm looking at early numbers now for the next forecast, which will come out tomorrow, i.e. Friday or Saturday. And it's not unreasonable to think Reform could come away with 5 or 7 or 6 or, half a dozen seats. It is within their grasp, basically. But in polling, it's all noise. That one poll putting them ahead is noise. It's just that, okay? It's one poll, but the narrowing is happening. The narrowing is happening. And it's not happening between the Conservatives and Labour. It's happening between the Conservatives and Reform.
And there was a poll, I think, on Sunday, which put them as having 7 seats, like the same poll predicted an absolute catastrophe for the Conservatives and a supermajority for Labour. But you don't think that's unrealistic now, 7 seats?
Oh, no, it's not. I'm so sorry. I am someone who believes in, if something is 9 times out of 10 likely to happen, I tend to put all my money in that 9 times out of 10. This is the 1 in 10 times out of 10 likely to happen, i.e. the polls do not narrow. Labour's lead remains as is. The smaller parties get squeezed. The Conservative base rallies. It's not. This is not normal, okay? This doesn't normally happen in general elections where the incumbent party has been in the doldrums, because when the campaign comes, things normally rally back to them. And what we're seeing now is those undecided Tory Boris backing, that undecided Tory Boris backing base, now saying, yeah, I'll still vote. I'll vote Reform, or I'll vote Labour. I want to get this lot out. I believe the time is for a change. If any of you watching or listening are subscribed to the Morning Call newsletter that I do chart most days, and one of them was finding the Tory base is very split on the question, do you think this election is a change election? A third of them do. That is not normal. That is not normal. And so that's why I'm looking at all these forecasts, and even the Britain Predicts forecast available on the New Statesman website, satn.newstatesman.com, finding, my goodness me, the Conservatives on 70, 80, 90 seats. Okay, I still think the polls will rally, but this is where we are right now. And again, they're not just a margin of error away from annihilation. They're a margin of error away from Reform coming away with half a dozen to 2 dozen to a few dozen seats. Google Canada 1993. Not to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, because I'm sounding quite manic right now, but we are close to that. Yes, we are close to that.
Wow. Take us to Scotland, because Chris has obviously, we've just gone through the manifestos. Yesterday we had Scottish Labour, today the SNP. What is the most important thing that is determining how Scottish voters are going to lean come polling day? What?
Yeah. So the thing with Scotland is it's a little bit different to the rest of the United Kingdom, as indeed every quarter of the United Kingdom is different to the rest of the United Kingdom. But in Scotland, you have the dynamic of independence versus the Union. And so you have a lot of voters who prioritise the Union over a lot of other things, thinking my priority here at this election is to beat the nationalist parties. And the only nationalist party in town with any semblance of winning any seats is the Scottish National Party. And what you'll therefore have in a lot of seats are voters of both the Tories and Labour thinking, which of us is best placed to beat the SNP? In a lot of urban and central belt Scotland, a lot of Edinburgh, a lot of County Fife, you're going to be having Scottish Tory voters, those who, went from Gordon Brown's Labour Party to Ruth Davidson's Tory Party, now saying Anas Sarwar's Keir Starmer's Labour Party is right up for me. And they're going to do that, which will give Labour enough votes to eclipse the SNP in a lot of these seats. On the inverse, you might see some Labour voters, not as many by any stretch, some Labour voters going to the Scottish Tories in a lot of the more county, rural shire seats, such as in Dumfriesshire, Aberdeenshire, and others. And that's why I wrote another piece saying, the Scottish Tories won 6 seats, or well, around about half a dozen and a bit seats at the last election. It's not unreasonable to think that though they are getting absolutely annihilated in England and Wales, they might hold on to almost all of their seats in Scotland.
That's interesting. So Labour are sort of having to split where they're fighting. Like they need to fight against everyone.
Well, the SNP are the incumbents in Scotland, in a way, in a roundabout way. And so, if you're unhappy with the way Holyrood is doing things, and a lot of voters are since the decline and fall of Nicola Sturgeon, a lot of voters have lost faith with the SNP, a lot have lost faith with the Scottish government, and a lot of people who backed the SNP before are going Labour. There are some big defectors there, and so Labour are cleaning up, but they're also picking up. They're also trying to appease Scottish Tory voters and saying, we are still for the Union. We are still for the United Kingdom. Stick with us as we're the best outfit, the best vehicle to defeat the SNP. I think it's probably going to work. And yeah, as Chris was saying, the polls do point to the SNP losing a lot of seats. The Britain Predicts forecast has, I think, Labour on around about 24 seats, the SNP on 22. And a lot of these races, by the way, are coming right down to the wire. That tactical voting I talked about, that pro-union, that pro-independence tactical voting is going to be absolutely key on the 4th of July.
On the more overall polling, we've talked about reform and how that's holding up and or increasing. Do we see a dip generally across both the main parties? I mean, the Lib Dem's still doing very well. I mean, talk about a democratic deficit potentially happening come July the 5th, where you have an enormous Labour Party in terms of parliamentary majority, but actually not on a huge vote share. Are we seeing a fall in support for Labour as well, but it matters less because the Conservatives aren't doing well?
Yeah, we're seeing a slight drift. So, reminder of the polls: Labour was on 41, 42, 43%. And they rose. They started to rise a little bit to 43% by the end of May. They drifted back down to 41, 40, and you're seeing some polls again. It's within the margin of error. It's noise. Let's not get too obsessed with those. Having them on 30 something. Okay, and yes, but nevertheless, Britain Elect Poll Tracker measures all the polls, is finding a slight drift. 2 things of this. Primarily, it is because more people are coming on the pitch of electors. So here's the football analogy that I am completely underqualified to talk about. Okay, imagine you've got 100 people on a pitch and Labour's got about 50 of them. That was the polls in May. Now there's 120 people on the pitch and Labour's still got about 50 of them.
Right.
Okay. And and you see what I mean there. So Labour isn't necessarily shedding any new support or any support whatsoever. They may actually slightly, a little bit, so it might be down to 49, 48. But overwhelmingly, what is happening is those undecided voters, those who came out for the Conservatives in 2019, who were undecided throughout, from the Liz Truss bender, from during the Rishi Sunak years, we're already talking about it as if it's past tense now, who were undecided then. They are now saying, I am going to vote. I am going to re-engage with the democratic civic process, but I'm not going to return to the Conservatives as I normally would, as a supporter of an incumbent party in 9 times out of 10 elections. So they're just returning to the pitch of engaged politics, and they're coming for other parties in some parts of, rural England, and especially in Suffolk. Keep an eye on Waveney Valley. That does mean some Tories going to the Greens. It definitely means going to Reform. The wild polls for Reform, it really is something. You have YouGov finding almost 3 in 10 to 4 in 10 2019 Tory voters going Reform. And that compares to about 1 in 10 about a few months ago. If that crossover happened, i.e., if more Conservative voters think the best party of the right, the best party that reflects me, is Reform, not the Conservatives, we could see a crossover, a dramatic change. And to reiterate, Canada 1993 would be the closest comparator. Do I think it's likely? No. Do I think it's probable? No. I just think it's possible, and we've got to prepare for it.